So we're going to look at the USA culture and sport, and what we're actually looking for within this topic is how what society is like in the States can be reflected in the sports that they play and how they play those sports. So the specification, here's a couple of key elements that we must ensure that you know. You've got to be able to describe the characteristics of the USA, and in brackets there it actually tells you very loosely some of the key things to make sure you appreciate that it's a relatively young country, capitalistic nation, relatively large population. You've got to be able to explain the nature of sport in the States, so these key terms, the win ethic, commercialism, and the American dream, and how sport can achieve that American dream. And then finally, we need to look at analysing the game of American football, how it originated, what the characteristics of the game is like, what the nature of the game is like, and also how violence and commercialism pervade it. So, the United States, as we know it, is a relatively young country in that whilst it was inhabited by some indigenous people, it wasn't really colonised until relatively recent. So we in the UK have a vast history of kings and queens, that we can talk about, whereas the States really is relatively only a couple of hundred years ago that it very much established in terms of the modern world. First President George Washington, perhaps a little bit of a less important detail. It's really important we appreciate that it's a capitalist economy, and we'll talk about that. And also 300, I'm sure that's out of date now as a value, but 300 million people approximately inhabit the United States. Huge, vast nation. And in comparison actually to Australia, the other country we need to look at during the AS study, and the UK, so that whilst Australia is actually, this is not to scale, but Australia is relatively large, certainly compared to us. It's the smallest continent, but the biggest country. And we are tiny in comparison, but we actually have more people inhabiting our country than does Australia, but it's nowhere near the number that inhabit the United States. So it is a vast population. And here you can say, again, it's probably not absolutely to scale, certainly not the UK image here, but this superimposes Australia over the United States. So that shows you in comparison to, in terms of numbers, 21 to 300 million. 21 million in Australia, and 300 million in America, and 60 in us, this relatively tiny country. So geographically, what are the implications of the topography that the United States has? Now, obviously there's quite a vast coast, east and west coast, but in amidst it all we've got very, very varied terrain. We've got mountainous regions, we've got desert regions, so there's again different climates that are associated with each of those. Again, quite desperate cold Alaskan environment also. So the geography is incredibly varied, and some cases it's a very, very harsh place to be. So some of the deserts, some of the mountainous areas, very harsh. And as I said already, we've even got different time differences between different states or different sides of the country, let alone the climatic variations. So in order to travel from A to B, you've got vast, vast distances to have to go. And obviously that will influence the sport that may be played within the country. So you'll find, whereas in our UK leagues we'll travel, a couple hundred miles maybe to play teams, whereas in the States you're talking about thousands of miles, and sometimes that might not be done. Because it's so vast, it has decentralized control, so the different states are autonomous. They have control of their own structures, and whether that's political or sporting. There are 50 states, and as I said, it's very, very huge variety of urban sprawls and wilderness. So again, very, very varied, but very multicultural, and that's a lot to do with the fact that immigration has been and is continuing to be huge in terms of how the US is populated. So the implications for the geography, the terrain that the US possesses, obviously quite a vast variety, and as a result of that, a variety of sports are very prominent. So outdoor pursuits, camping, water sports, climbing, hiking, because that fits with the terrain that is natural in that country. But what about the history? So how did it become populated as it is? So we should appreciate that there were native Indians inhabiting the states. The indigenous people were the native Indians, and actually early people to settle in the states and eventually, I guess, to take over this area, this new land, this new world, were Puritan settlers. Now we know Puritans characteristically are very, very hardworking, very honest, very good at working together to achieve, important outcomes. And in those days, it was about survival. So these people worked incredibly hard, were courageous, were determined, faced adversity. But they were basically doing this to survive. But those characteristics then became normal for American people. What essentially happened is that colonization occurred again. So we inhabited early in the East Coast here, and as time went by and word got out that there's this vast new land which could be inhabited by people to make their new life and their fortune, colonization occurred, and basically the population spread from east to west. Now, the inhabiting territories in this land in this early time relied on the characteristics of the people, those Puritans and other settlers, and this phrase frontier spirit very much embodies the characteristics that these people had. So we talked about this Puritan work ethic, being really tough, hard-working people. They really had to pioneer new life in this hostile country, hostile land, really extreme temperatures in the summer, really extreme temperatures in the winter, but they were very much about survival, getting up every time things got tough. They faced hardship and they were very determined. They had emotional and physical strength. And again, when we think about the Wild West, movies, we think about a very macho image, very tough, hardy people. And actually, this, as I said, these characteristics associated with frontier spirit were the foundation of the American dream, of the way people aspired to do as best as they could in their country. Actually, frontierism and all those characteristics and the outdoor life may be associated in part with how big summer camps are in the States. It's very normal for kids to go off to summer camps in the summer in their holidays. But there's maybe a connection there with the skills that the kids learn in these camps and the skills and the characteristics those early settlers had in surviving. But three frontiers really exist, and we just need to be aware of these. The first one, we've already mentioned, this frontier spirit and spreading of the population and habitation of the US from the east to the west coast. The secondly, it's not sort of directly a frontier, but was very significant in terms of them getting their own boundaries in their country. And actually the French, the Spanish, the British all tried to take over and rule the states. And ultimately they got independence from us in 1776, and this was considered a second frontier. Finally, it's been argued that sporting performance, really pushing the boundaries of performance, would be considered the final frontier. And actually Lance Armstrong there is perhaps an important image to have there, because in a bid to push boundaries, to be so successful, actually he had deviant behaviour. He essentially cheated, and that's maybe a risk with wishing to push sporting boundaries just so far. So the population over 300 million, predominantly white, but you can see there's a huge variety. It's very multicultural and very pluralist, in that for the most part, more and more and more, each ethnic minority is getting increasingly respected there. So historically, in terms of population in the US, we've got the indigenous people who inhabited the country before it was found. Then colonization occurred from various countries. The US then got independence, but immigration continues to be a significant factor in how they are populated. A lot of people seek life there as a way of, it's a land of opportunity, which makes it a very multicultural society and also a pluralist society. So there is, whilst obviously there are wealthy and less wealthy, there's not quite a significant class system as the UK has absolutely had. So reflecting the US culture in sport, it's capitalist, it's a free market, it's profit driven, there's fierce competition in business world, and actually we can see this in in sport played and how the sport is run in the US. It's very commercial, it's run on franchises, that means businesses, it's about profit, it's about win at all cost, it's very, very fiercely competitive, and a lot of athletes seek to go into sport to gain success and to be wealthy and get themselves out of poverty. So actually we've got a few terms there that we need to clarify. Capitalism then. Capitalism is an economic system, and the States is run in a capitalistic way in that it's about businesses being controlled by owners whose intention is to make profit in a free market economy. So it's a competitive business world with the aim of achieving success by having more. Franchises are methods of owning businesses. So sports teams are actually run as businesses, they are franchises. And also we've talked about pluralism, where cultural identities are actually respected and remain even despite being part of a big society. So given it's such a multicultural country, it does generally respect the different cultural identities. So there's a key term that we need to understand called the Lombardian or win ethic. And this basically evolved from this guy, Vince Lombardi, a coach of the Green Bay Packers American football team, who really following on in the capitalist way. Capitalism is about cutthroat profit, making money at whatever it takes. And he had this attitude, but in a sports element. So it's all about winning at all costs. Winning isn't everything, it's the only thing. There's only one way to succeed in anything, and that's to give it everything. And I do, and I demand that my players. So he doesn't accept anything other than 100% effort so that the team wins. This very cutthroat approach then is very much representative and reflected of the capitalist economy of society, but an approach that is apparent in US sport. So the win ethic, it doesn't matter how you win, it's all about winning, and that will bring about really emotional intensities because it matters, it's got such high stakes. It's incredibly competitive, the rewards are vast, you get loads of money and you get fame, and it's all structured about competition and winning. The end justifies the mean. There's no, actually, in the rules of the sports in the States, there's no draws. It's you either win or you lose. And the trouble is, though, with this emotional intensity and the stakes at hand, it can lead to deviant behaviour. So Lance Armstrong, cheated, but maybe it mattered just so much that he was a winner. He's this, in a way, suffering from Lombardian ethic. American sport's all about professionals, so it's about being paid and winning to get more money. There's very little amateur structure of sport in the US. And because it's so cutthroat, it's, coaches are hired and fired. If they're not doing well, they'll be out. Success in this context is judged as winning. It really matters less about improving. In the UK, we respect effort, we respect, trying hard, whereas in the States, whilst effort matters, it's a means to winning, and that's what matters more. So there are actually 3 different ethics you might need to be mindful of. The Lombardian ethic here is the one I've just talked about, where it's competitive, cutting edge, and all about winning. The other extreme is counterculture ethic, where outcome doesn't matter. What matters most is how you play, how you learn, how you feel, process. It's not into competition at all. Competition can be unhealthy. Where in the middle we've got this radical ethic, where the UK is, I'd say, where an outcome does matter, but so does process. So trying hard, striving for excellence is okay, but how you go about it and doing that in the right way matters. So here's a summary of the 3 ethical approaches: Lombardian, or the win ethic, where outcome is everything; radical, in the middle, outcome matters but process matters too; and counterculture, which is the other extreme, where process is 100% important.